The Kepler station auction house buzzed with the usual mix of species that made up the Galactic Trade Consortium. Zephyrians with their crystalline wings caught the artificial light, while the hulking Korathi delegates rumbled in their deep, subsonic language. Mercantile Vexians skittered between potential buyers, their multiple arms gesturing wildly as they promoted various lots. In the midst of this interstellar commerce sat Marcus Chen, human, unremarkable by most standards, clutching a worn datapad with exactly 63 credits to his name. The auctioneer, a pompous Altarian whose blue-tinged skin seemed to shimmer with each dramatic gesture, called out the next lot. Hangar Bay 17, Kepler Station Lower Dock, reserve price 50 credits. This magnificent storage facility offers over 10,000 cubic meters of space, perfect for cargo operations or manufacturing. What the auctioneer didn't mention, and what every pilot in 3 sectors knew, was that Hangar Bay 17 carried a reputation darker than the void between stars. For 47 years, not a single vessel had docked there for more than a few hours. Ships that stayed overnight reported system failures, crew nightmares, and an inexplicable sense of dread that lingered long after departure. The hangar had become a joke among spacers, a cautionary tale told in dim cantinas across the rim worlds. Marcus had heard the stories, but stories didn't pay debts or put food in his belly. 6 months ago, he'd been first engineer aboard the merchant vessel Prosperity's Dream, a respectable position that kept him comfortable and fed. Then came the accusations. Equipment failures that couldn't be explained, cargo that went missing, and fingers pointed in his direction when the ship's captain needed a scapegoat. The fact that Marcus had been in engineering, alone, during each incident made him an easy target. "Do I hear 50 credits?" The auctioneer's voice carried across the chamber, met with uncomfortable silence. Even the typically aggressive Vexian traders seemed suddenly fascinated by their personal devices. Marcus raised his hand, feeling every eye in the room turn toward him. The auctioneer blinked his large, compound eyes in surprise. 50 credits to the human gentleman. Do I hear 60? Silence stretched like the emptiness between galaxies. 60 credits? A note of desperation crept into the auctioneer's practiced tone. This is prime real estate, beings. 55? Still nothing. Marcus watched species that regularly bid on asteroid mining rights and entire planetary agricultural contracts suddenly find their boots intensely interesting. Going once at 50 credits. The auctioneer's gavel hovered in the air. Going twice. His compound eyes swept the room one final time, settling on Marcus with what might have been pity. Sold, to the human, for 50 credits. A collective sigh seemed to ripple through the auction house, the kind of sound a crowd makes when watching someone walk into an obvious trap. Marcus transferred his credits with shaking fingers, leaving him with exactly 13 to his name. As the auction moved on to more desirable lots, beings began filing out, giving Marcus a wide berth as though bad luck might be contagious. "You know what you just bought, don't you?" The voice belonged to Captain Vexi, a grizzled Korathi freighter pilot whose hide bore the scars of a dozen different wars. His massive frame cast Marcus in shadow as he approached. "A hangar," Marcus replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Vexi's laugh rumbled like distant thunder. "You bought a tomb, human. That place has been eating ships and crews since before you were born. Whatever's wrong with that hangar, it's not something you can fix with spare parts and determination. Maybe it just needs someone who isn't afraid of stories," Marcus said, though his bravado felt thin even to his own ears. The Korathi's expression shifted to something that might have been respect. "Fear keeps you alive out here, little human. Pride gets you spaced." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But, if you're determined to throw your life away, at least do it with dignity. The humans who built that hangar 47 years ago, they weren't afraid either. Look how that turned out for them." As the auction house emptied, Marcus found himself alone with his thoughts and his newly acquired property. Hangar Bay 17. He'd heard fragments of the story over the years, usually from drunk pilots in spaceport bars. Something about a human construction crew that had vanished during the final phase of the station's expansion. Official reports claimed equipment failures and structural collapse, but the stories told in whispered voices painted darker pictures. The journey to the lower docks took Marcus through sections of Kepler station he'd never seen before. Where the upper levels gleamed with polished metal and carefully maintained atmospheric processors, the lower docks showed their age. Rust stains crept along bulkheads like spreading infections, and the lighting had the yellow, sickly cast of failing power cells. Hangar Bay 17 sat at the end of a long corridor, separated from its neighbors by blast doors that hadn't been opened in decades. The access panel glowed amber, indicating standby power but no active systems. Marcus placed his palm on the scanner and waited as ancient sensors confirmed his new ownership status. The blast doors groaned as they cycled open, revealing an expanse of darkness that his handheld light couldn't fully penetrate. The air that rushed out carried the metallic tang of recycled atmosphere and something else, something that made his sinuses burn and his eyes water. He stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. The hangar stretched before him like a cathedral built for giants. Support columns rose into shadows above, and docking clamps lay dormant along the walls like sleeping metal beasts. Everything appeared normal, functional even, but there was something wrong with the proportions. The space felt larger inside than it should have been, as though the walls existed slightly further away than his eyes insisted they were. Marcus activated the main lighting grid, and panels flickered to life one by one, revealing the hangar in harsh, white illumination. What he saw made him understand why pilots avoided this place. The floor, walls, and ceiling were covered in scratches. Not random wear from decades of use, but deliberate marks carved with desperate precision. Symbols that hurt to look at directly, equations that his mind refused to process, and text in languages he didn't recognize scratched into every available surface. At the far end of the hangar, barely visible beneath layers of graffiti and corrosion, stood a monument of sorts. As Marcus approached, he could make out names carved into a metal plaque, 47 of them, each followed by human construction specialist and a date from 47 years ago. Below the names, in larger text, were the words, they sought to build something greater than themselves. The memorial triggered something in Marcus's memory, a fragment of conversation overheard years ago in a transit station bar. An old-timer, probably drunk, rambling about humans who'd tried to prove something to the galaxy. They'd volunteered for the most dangerous construction jobs, the ones other species wouldn't touch, and they'd died doing it. But their work had held, the old spacer had insisted. Whatever they'd built, it was still standing. Marcus spent the next 3 hours exploring his purchase, documenting the damage and cataloging what needed repair. The life support systems functioned but hadn't been properly maintained in decades. The docking system showed wear but appeared operational. The scratched surfaces could be restored with enough patience and industrial-grade solvents. It was just a hangar, he told himself repeatedly. Just a very large, very empty room with some unfortunate history. But, as the station's artificial day cycle shifted toward evening, Marcus began to notice things that his rational mind struggled to dismiss. Shadows that moved when they shouldn't. Sounds that had no source. The sensation of being watched by something that existed just beyond the edge of perception. He set up a makeshift camp near the main entrance, using an emergency shelter kit he'd purchased with his last few credits. As he ate a ration-packed dinner, Marcus reviewed the technical specifications he'd downloaded from the station's archives. Hangar Bay 17 had been the final addition to Kepler Station's lower dock complex, designed and built by an all-human crew as part of a demonstration project. The Galactic Trade Consortium had been skeptical about human engineering capabilities, viewing the newest spacefaring species as primitive compared to races that had been building space stations for millennia. The human team had volunteered to prove themselves by constructing the most challenging part of the expansion, a hangar bay that could accommodate the largest vessels in the fleet while maintaining perfect atmospheric containment. They'd worked around the clock for 6 months, pushing themselves and their equipment beyond normal limits. Then, on the final day before the hangar's scheduled activation, they'd all vanished. Security recordings showed them entering the hangar for final system checks at the beginning of their shift. They were never seen leaving. When rescue teams arrived, they found no bodies, no signs of struggle, and no equipment failures that could explain 47 people simply ceasing to exist. The hangar itself functioned perfectly, every system operating within optimal parameters. The official investigation concluded that the crew had suffered some kind of collective psychological break and had somehow ejected themselves into space, though no airlocks showed signs of use and no bodies were ever recovered. The hangar was quietly sealed and forgotten, becoming another bureaucratic footnote in the consortium's endless files. As Marcus prepared for sleep, he noticed that the scratches on the wall seemed more pronounced in the evening lighting. What had appeared random during the day now showed patterns, deliberate arrangements that suggested meaning. Some of the equations looked familiar, theoretical physics concepts he'd studied during his engineering training but had never seen applied in practical contexts. The temperature in the hangar remained constant, but Marcus found himself shivering as he sealed his shelter. Through the transparent aluminum windows, he watched shadows dance across the scarred walls, patterns that defied the static positioning of the overhead lights. Every rational part of his mind insisted he was seeing things, that isolation and stress were playing tricks with his perception. But another part of him, a deeper part that remembered humanity's long climb from primitive tool users to starfaring engineers, whispered that some things existed beyond the comfortable boundaries of rational explanation. The human crew hadn't vanished through accident or equipment failure. They'd discovered something in this place, something that had consumed them completely. As sleep finally took him, Marcus dreamed of figures in construction gear working frantically on projects he couldn't quite see. They moved with desperate urgency, as though racing against some invisible deadline. In the dream, he could hear them speaking, but their words came from so far away that he couldn't make out individual syllables. When he tried to approach them, they receded like mirages, always just beyond reach. He woke to find new scratches on the wall beside his shelter, fresh marks that hadn't been there when he'd gone to sleep. The scratches formed a single word in standard galactic script: welcome. Marcus stared at the message until his eyes watered, then activated his portable scanner to document the fresh markings. The metal showed signs of recent scoring, but there were no tools in the hangar capable of making such precise cuts. More disturbing was the fact that the word appeared to be written in his own handwriting, if handwriting could be translated to scratches carved in metal. The morning shift change brought foot traffic to the corridor outside, and Marcus could hear other species discussing their own business in the adjacent hangars. Normal sounds of normal beings conducting normal commerce. The contrast between the ordinary bustle outside and the impossible message inside his hangar created a cognitive dissonance that made his hands shake as he prepared his morning meal. 60 cents. That's what Hangar Bay 17 had cost him after fees and taxes were deducted. 60 cents for 10,000 cubic meters of space in a prime location, and now he was beginning to understand why the price had been so low. The previous occupants had left more than just scratches on the walls. They'd left something of themselves, something that reached across decades to welcome new arrivals. Marcus finished his breakfast and began planning his first day of real work. Whatever haunted this place, whatever had consumed 47 human engineers, he would face it on his own terms. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, and Marcus Chin had been destroying weak versions of himself his entire life. It was time to find out what happened to the construction crew, and whether their fate would be his own. The scratches on the wall seemed to pulse with anticipation, as though the hangar itself was eager to reveal its secrets to someone finally brave enough or foolish enough to ask the right questions. The real work was about to begin. Marcus spent his first week in Hangar Bay 17 establishing routines that kept his mind occupied and his fears manageable. He divided the space into sections, methodically cleaning each area while documenting every scratch, equation, and symbol carved into the surfaces. The work was meditative, requiring enough concentration to prevent his imagination from running wild while keeping his hands busy with familiar tasks. The scratches told a story, though not one that made conventional sense. The earliest markings appeared near the main entrance, simple tally marks and basic engineering calculations. As Marcus worked his way deeper into the hangar, the inscriptions became more complex, evolving from standard mathematical notations to theoretical physics concepts that pushed the boundaries of current understanding. By the fourth day, he'd identified 7 distinct handwriting styles among the inscriptions, suggesting that at least 7 members of the original construction crew had participated in whatever obsession had driven them to cover every surface with their desperate scribblings. The names on the memorial plaque confirmed 47 team members, which meant 40 others had either refused to participate or had contributed in ways that left no written evidence. The breakthrough came when Marcus found the first date stamp. Hidden beneath layers of more recent scratches, someone had carved day 1, we see it now, with coordinates that corresponded to a section of the hangar's far wall. Following the coordinates led him to what appeared to be a structural anomaly, a place where the metal seemed slightly warped, as though it had been subjected to stresses that shouldn't exist in a properly constructed space station. That night, Marcus dreamed again of the construction crew, but this time the figures were clearer, more distinct. He could see their faces now, drawn and haggard, their eyes reflecting a kind of desperate excitement that bordered on madness. They worked in shifts around the clock, but their project wasn't the hangar itself. They were building something else, something that required precise calculations and materials that shouldn't have been available on a frontier space station. When he woke, Marcus found a new message scratched beside his shelter. Day 8, the mathematics are beautiful. The pattern became clear over the following days. Each morning brought a new message, dated in sequence and apparently responding to his own investigation. The impossible nature of the situation should have sent him fleeing back to the upper levels, but instead it filled him with a familiar sense of purpose. For the first time since losing his position aboard Prosperity's Dream, Marcus felt like he was working on something that mattered. The construction crew hadn't vanished. They'd discovered something in this hangar, something that had consumed their attention so completely that they'd lost track of everything else. The messages were their way of communicating across time, of sharing their obsession with someone finally equipped to understand. Marcus began responding to the messages, using a plasma cutter to carve his own inscriptions below theirs. His first reply was simple: "I'm listening." The next morning, he found a response that made his breath catch. Day 12, show him the design. The design revealed itself over the course of a week, emerging from the chaos of scratches like a hidden image in a puzzle. It wasn't carved into the walls but formed by the walls themselves, the anomalies and distortions in the hangar's structure combining to create a three-dimensional blueprint for something that defied conventional physics. The construction crew had discovered that Hangar Base 17 wasn't just a storage facility. It was a machine, designed and built using principles that current galactic science couldn't explain. Every support beam, every wall panel, every piece of seemingly mundane infrastructure had been positioned with mathematical precision to create a device whose purpose remained tantalizingly unclear. Marcus spent days mapping the design, using every scanning tool he could afford to purchase with his dwindling credits. The results confirmed what the crew's calculations had suggested. The hangar was some kind of amplification device, designed to magnify and focus energy in ways that violated several fundamental laws of physics. The discovery should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with the same desperate excitement he could see reflected in the construction crew's increasingly frantic inscriptions. They'd stumbled upon something unprecedented, something that represented a leap forward in understanding comparable to the invention of faster-than-light travel or artificial gravity. Day 23, we know what it does now, appeared on the wall beside his shelter, followed the next morning by Day 24, the weak fear what they cannot understand. Marcus understood the reference immediately. Throughout human history, every great leap forward had been opposed by those who preferred the comfort of ignorance to the challenge of growth. The construction crew had faced the same choice that now confronted him: retreat to the safety of conventional thinking or push forward into uncharted territory. He chose to push forward. The first activation attempt came 2 weeks later, after Marcus had spent days rewiring the hangar's power systems according to the crew's specifications. The modifications were subtle, almost invisible, but they redirected the station's energy flow in ways that turned the entire hangar into a single, massive circuit. When he finally activated the system, the response was immediate and overwhelming. The scratches on the walls began to glow with soft, blue-white light, and the air itself seemed to thicken with potential energy. For a moment, Marcus could see them clearly: 47 figures in construction gear standing throughout the hangar, their faces turned toward him with expressions of profound recognition. They weren't ghosts or hallucinations. They were echoes, imprints left behind when the hangar's unique properties had recorded their final moments. But these weren't moments of death or disappearance. They were moments of transformation, of evolution into something greater than baseline humanity. The crew leader stepped forward, her form more solid than the others, and spoke directly to Marcus's mind. You understand now why we couldn't leave. Why we had to become part of the design. Marcus did understand. The hangar wasn't just a machine, it was a chrysalis, a transformation device built by some ancient civilization and disguised as ordinary infrastructure. The construction crew had activated it accidentally, but instead of fighting the changes it induced, they'd embraced them completely. "What did you become?" Marcus asked, his voice echoing strangely in the charged atmosphere. "More than human," the crew leader replied. "Less than human. Different. We exist in the spaces between thoughts now, in the mathematics that describe reality's hidden structures. We've seen the universe as it truly is, not as biology limits us to perceive it." Over the following hours, the crew shared their knowledge with Marcus, downloading 47 years of accumulated understanding directly into his consciousness. He learned that the galaxy was riddled with similar devices, ancient machines left behind by a civilization that had transcended physical existence millennia ago. Most species that discovered them were too primitive to activate them safely, or too conservative to risk the transformation they offered. Humans were different. They'd always been willing to risk everything for the chance to become something greater than they were. The construction crew had recognized this quality in their own species and had chosen to become pioneers once again, explorers of a frontier that existed in consciousness rather than physical space. "The choice is yours now," the crew leader explained. "Join us in evolution, or return to the limitations of flesh and fear. But know that there is no going back once the transformation begins." Marcus looked around the hangar, seeing it now as the other members of his species saw it, not as a haunted storage facility but as a gateway to unprecedented growth. The scratches on the walls weren't signs of madness but mathematical poetry, equations that described the beauty of existence beyond physical constraints. He thought about his life before this moment, the series of failures and disappointments that had led him to bid on an abandoned hangar with his last 60 cents. Every setback, every humiliation, every moment of weakness had been preparation for this choice. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, and Marcus Chin had been destroying weak versions of himself for 34 years. "I'm not ready yet," he told the crew leader, surprising himself with the admission. "I need to understand more before I can make that commitment." The spectral figure smiled, and Marcus sensed approval rather than disappointment. "Wisdom is the beginning of transformation. We'll wait. We've been waiting 47 years, we can wait longer." The activation slowly faded, the walls returning to their normal metallic gray, but Marcus could still feel the potential humming beneath the surface. The hangar was alive, patient, offering unlimited growth to anyone brave enough to accept its gifts. Over the following weeks, Marcus established a new routine. Days were spent studying the crew's calculations and experimenting with low-level activations of the hangar's systems. Nights were devoted to long conversations with the transformed engineers, learning about the universe's hidden structures and humanity's unique role in the cosmic order. He discovered that humans weren't the first species to find and activate these ancient machines, but they were the first to do so voluntarily and with full understanding of the consequences. Other species had stumbled into transformation through accident or desperation, emerging as something alien and disconnected from their origins. The construction crew had approached their metamorphosis differently. They'd studied the process, documented every stage, and maintained their essential humanity even as they transcended its limitations. They remained recognizably themselves, just operating on expanded levels of consciousness and perception. "The key," explained Chief Engineer Sarah Okafor, whose spectral form flickered with equations that described multidimensional space, "is to embrace change without losing identity. Evolution, not replacement." Marcus began to understand why the Galactic Trade Consortium had been so quick to seal and forget Hangar Bay 17. The other species weren't ready for this kind of advancement. They'd spent millennia building civilizations based on the assumption that consciousness was limited to biological forms, and the existence of these transformation devices challenged every foundation of their societies. Humans, with their relatively brief spacefaring history and willingness to adapt, represented something unprecedented, a species that could evolve voluntarily while maintaining ethical and emotional connections to their origins. The construction crew had become humanity's first ambassadors to a realm of existence that most of the galaxy couldn't even conceive. But transformation required sacrifice, and Marcus wasn't certain he was ready to give up the physical existence that had defined his entire life. The crew had assured him that the change preserved consciousness and personality, but they couldn't communicate what it felt like to exist as living mathematics, as patterns of thought woven into the universe's fundamental structure. His uncertainty created a strange sort of limbo. The hangar responded to his presence, activating at low levels whenever he needed guidance or companionship. The transformed crew shared their knowledge freely, teaching him to see reality's hidden dimensions and to understand the elegant mathematics that govern consciousness itself. Yet Marcus remained stubbornly, determinedly human, clinging to limitations that the crew had long since abandoned. He ate food they could no longer taste, slept in cycles they'd transcended, and worried about physical needs they'd evolved beyond. "You're afraid," observed Dr. James Wright, the crew's former physicist, during one of their evening conversations. "Not of death, but of becoming something your current mind can't imagine." Marcus nodded, accepting the observation without shame. Every human fear is based on the unknown. We've always been afraid of becoming something we can't understand in advance. "And yet you've always become those things anyway," Dr. Wright replied. "Fear didn't stop humans from leaving Earth, or mastering faster-than-light travel, or joining the Galactic Trade Consortium. You've spent your entire species' history becoming things your ancestors couldn't imagine." The truth of the statement hit Marcus like a physical force. Humans had always been a species in constant transformation, always pushing beyond the boundaries of what they thought possible. The construction crew had simply taken that fundamental human drive to its logical conclusion. As his second month in the hangar drew to a close, Marcus realized he'd been preparing for transformation without consciously acknowledging it. Every day spent studying the crew's work, every night spent in conversation with transcended consciousness, every moment spent existing in harmony with the hangar's strange energies had been moving him closer to a decision he'd been avoiding. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Marcus Chen had spent his life destroying weak versions of himself, but he'd always replaced them with stronger versions of the same fundamental identity. The transformation the hangar offered would require destroying not just weakness but the entire framework of human limitation. The question was whether he had the courage to destroy himself so completely that what emerged could barely be called Marcus Chen at all. The answer, he was beginning to suspect, would determine not just his own fate but humanity's role in the greater cosmic order. The decision came to Marcus on a Tuesday morning, 3 months after purchasing the hangar, as he watched a consortium inspection team approach through the exterior viewing portal. Their presence meant someone had finally noticed the energy anomalies his experiments were generating, and questions would soon follow that he couldn't answer without revealing the hangar's true nature. He'd always known this moment would arrive. The low-level activations had been increasing in intensity as his understanding deepened, and the sophisticated sensors throughout Kepler Station would eventually detect the impossible energy signatures emanating from Hangar Bay 17. The inspection team represented the end of his isolation and the beginning of a choice he could no longer postpone. "They're here," he said aloud, knowing the crew would sense his words through the hangar's quantum-entangled consciousness field. Chief Engineer Okafor's form materialized beside him, her expression carrying the weight of 47 years spent watching the galaxy struggle to understand concepts it wasn't ready to accept. "The consortium will shut this place down permanently if they discover what we've built. They'll classify it as a hazardous anomaly and seal it behind barriers we can't penetrate." Marcus nodded, understanding the implications. The transformation device had waited unknown millennia for a species capable of using it properly. If the consortium succeeded in quarantining Hangar Bay 17, that opportunity might never come again. "How long do I have?" he asked. "Minutes," replied Dr. Wright, his spectral form flickering with calculation matrices. "They're already detecting energy patterns that violate conventional physics. Once they run comparative analyses, they'll realize this hangar represents technology beyond current galactic understanding." The inspection team consisted of 5 beings, 2 Altarians with their advanced sensor arrays, a Karathi security specialist, and 2 Vexians whose multiple arms allowed them to operate scanning equipment with frightening efficiency. They moved with the methodical precision of investigators who'd uncovered countless mysteries in the galaxy's darker corners. Marcus watched them set up their equipment and felt something shift inside his consciousness. For 3 months, he'd been preparing for this moment without realizing it. Every conversation with the crew, every experiment with the Hangar's systems, every night spent studying the mathematics of transcendent consciousness had been leading toward this inevitable choice. He could surrender the Hangar to the inspection team, allow them to classify it as dangerous and seal it forever. Such a choice would preserve his current existence but doom humanity's chance at voluntary evolution. Or he could activate the transformation device fully, accepting whatever changes it imposed and trusting that the construction crew's 47 years of experience would guide him through the process. "If I do this," Marcus said quietly, "what happens to you? Do you move on to whatever comes next, or do you remain here?" "We become part of you," Okafor explained. "Our consciousness merges with yours, creating something greater than the sum of its parts. You retain your identity and memories, but you gain access to everything we've learned during our time in the transformed state." "And if the process goes wrong?" "It can't," Dr. Wright interjected. "The device doesn't make mistakes. It reads consciousness at the quantum level and rebuilds it according to patterns that optimize for growth and understanding. The only variable is how completely the subject embraces the change." Marcus understood. Fear and resistance would create internal conflicts that could tear consciousness apart during the transformation process. Complete acceptance and trust would allow the device to work as designed, preserving everything essential while discarding the limitations that confined awareness to biological parameters. The inspection team had finished their preliminary scans and were now calibrating deep field sensors that would penetrate the Hangar's quantum shielding. They had perhaps 5 minutes before detecting the full extent of the anomalies hidden within the walls. "I need to know something," Marcus said, turning to address the entire crew at once. "Why did you choose this? What made 47 human engineers decide to abandon everything they'd known for the promise of something they couldn't understand?" The answer came not from any individual crew member but from all of them simultaneously, their merged consciousness speaking with a single voice. "Because we recognized ourselves in the mathematics. The equations that describe transcendent consciousness aren't alien constructs imposed by foreign minds. They're the logical endpoint of everything humanity has always been reaching toward." Marcus felt the truth of the statement resonate in every cell of his body. Humans had always been the species that asked what if and, then, acted on the answer. They'd always chosen growth over safety, understanding over comfort, possibility over limitation. The construction crew had simply carried that fundamental human drive to its ultimate conclusion. The inspection team's sensors were beginning to penetrate the Hangar's outer defenses, detecting energy patterns that shouldn't exist according to current scientific understanding. In minutes, they would sound alarms that would bring consortium enforcement teams, academic researchers, and ultimately the kind of attention that would transform the Hangar into a classified research facility. Marcus placed his hand on the activation panel he'd spent weeks modifying according to the crew's specifications. The surface felt warm beneath his palm, responding to his bioelectric field with eager anticipation. "The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others," he whispered, repeating the phrase that had guided him through every transformation in his life. Then, he activated the device. The response was instantaneous and overwhelming. Every scratch on the Hangar's walls blazed with blue-white radiance, and the air itself seemed to crystallize into geometric patterns that hurt to observe directly. The space around Marcus began to bend and twist, reality reshaping itself according to mathematical principles that existed beyond the constraints of normal physics. He felt his consciousness expand first, awareness stretching to encompass dimensions he'd never known existed. The boundaries of his individual mind became permeable, allowing the crew's collective knowledge to flow into his awareness like water filling an empty vessel. Their memories became his memories, their understanding became his understanding, their transcendent perspective became the foundation for his new existence. But, instead of losing himself in their collective identity, Marcus found his sense of self becoming stronger, more defined. The transformation process amplified everything essentially human about him while discarding the limitations that had constrained his growth. He remained Marcus Chen, but Marcus Chen evolved, expanded, elevated beyond the narrow confines of biological existence. His body underwent changes that should have been impossible. Flesh became something more than flesh, matter organized according to principles that allowed consciousness to inhabit it more completely. He could still move and speak and interact with physical reality, but those activities no longer defined the boundaries of his existence. The inspection team's sensors registered the massive energy discharge and immediately triggered emergency protocols. Alarms began sounding throughout the lower dock complex, and blast doors started sealing as automated systems attempted to contain what they interpreted as a catastrophic reactor failure. But Marcus, transformed beyond their ability to detect or understand, simply walked through the walls of his hangar as though they were constructed from light and intention rather than metal and composites. The physical barriers that had once contained his existence now served as mere suggestions, obstacles that could be navigated through understanding rather than circumvented through force. He found the inspection team huddled behind emergency barriers, their scanning equipment overloaded and sparking from the energies it had attempted to measure. The Altarians were transmitting frantic reports to their supervisors, describing sensor readings that violated fundamental laws of physics. The Korathi was checking and rechecking his security protocols, searching for threats he couldn't identify or quantify. Marcus appeared among them not through teleportation or faster-than-light travel, but through a simple redefinition of where he was in relation to where he wanted to be. The mathematical equations governing space and time became suggestions rather than absolute constraints. "Hello," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated in dimensions the inspection team couldn't perceive. "I believe you have questions about this facility." The lead Altarian's compound eyes dilated to maximum aperture, trying to process what his sensors were telling him about the impossible being standing before them. You're the human who purchased this hangar. But the energy readings suggest, what are you?" "I'm what humans become when they stop accepting limitations," Marcus replied, and the truth of the statement manifested as visible light patterns around his transformed form. "This hangar isn't a storage facility. It's a graduation ceremony." Over the following hours, Marcus shared his understanding with the inspection team, helping them comprehend truths that challenged every assumption their species had made about consciousness, evolution, and the nature of existence itself. The Altarians were the first to grasp the implications, their highly developed scientific minds recognizing the elegance of the mathematics involved. The Korathi security specialist proved surprisingly adaptable, his warrior culture's emphasis on self-improvement allowing him to appreciate the concept of voluntary transformation. The Vexians, with their inherently cautious nature, required more convincing but eventually acknowledged the logical consistency of the evidence. "Where does this lead?" asked the lead Altarian. "If consciousness can be restructured and expanded, what becomes of our civilizations, our identities, our understanding of what it means to be alive?" Marcus smiled, an expression that now carried depths of meaning impossible for biological features to convey. "That depends on whether you're brave enough to find out. This hangar is the first of many such devices hidden throughout the galaxy. The beings who built them left them for species ready to take the next step in evolution." "And you believe humans are ready?" "I believe humans have always been ready. We've just been waiting for the right moment to prove it." The inspection team's report to the consortium became the foundation for humanity's first official contact with transcendent consciousness. Rather than classifying Hangar Bay 17 as a hazardous anomaly, the consortium designated it as humanity's first evolutionary research facility, a place where voluntary transformation could be studied and understood. Marcus became the facility's first director, serving as an intermediary between baseline and transcendent consciousness. The construction crew, their knowledge now merged with his expanded awareness, helped design protocols that would allow other humans to make informed choices about their own potential transformation. Over the years that followed, Hangar Bay 17 became known throughout the galaxy as the place where humanity had chosen to evolve voluntarily rather than wait for evolution to be imposed upon them. Other species sent researchers and philosophers to study the implications, trying to understand how a relatively primitive spacefaring civilization had succeeded where ancient, advanced cultures had failed. The answer, Marcus discovered, lay in humanity's fundamental relationship with change itself. While other species viewed transformation as loss of identity, humans saw it as fulfillment of potential. They'd always been willing to destroy weak versions of themselves in order to become something stronger, better, more capable of facing the unknown. The hangar that pilots had avoided for decades became the launching point for humanity's greatest adventure, the voluntary evolution of consciousness itself. Marcus Chen, who had purchased the facility for 60 cents when he had nothing left to lose, became the first human to prove that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. And, in the mathematics that now governed his existence, in the equations that described consciousness unbound by biological limitations, Marcus found a truth that would guide humanity for generations to come: evolution isn't something that happens to you, it's something you choose to become. The scratches on the hangar walls still glowed with soft radiance, but they no longer carried messages of desperation and obsession. Instead, they served as welcome signs for other humans ready to take the next step, invitations to join a transformation that had been waiting eons for a species brave enough to accept its gifts. In the spaces between thoughts, in the dimensions that existed beyond physical constraints, 47 construction workers continued their eternal project, building bridges between what humanity was and what it could become. And Marcus Chen, no longer bound by the limitations that had defined his previous existence, stood ready to guide others across those bridges toward a future that defied imagination. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. In Hangar Bay 17, on a forgotten level of an unremarkable space station, humanity had discovered that the greatest enemy of growth isn't external opposition but internal resistance to change. And, in overcoming that resistance, they'd taken their first steps toward becoming something the universe had been waiting to welcome: a species evolved by choice rather than circumstance, transformed by understanding rather than necessity. The hangar waited, patient and eternal, for the next human ready to trade limitation for transcendence. The price remained the same, 60 cents, and the courage to become something greater than what you were.